While most weapons in World War II were feared for their ability to cause casualties, there was one that stood above all others in the minds of Japanese soldiers defending the Pacific Islands. It wasn't the massive naval guns, the dive bombers, or even the tanks. It was a backpack-mounted weapon that could turn their strongest fortifications into death traps. The M2-2 flamethrower became the most psychologically devastating weapon in the Pacific theater, and the reasons why reveal a dark and gruesome chapter of warfare that changed the nature of combat forever. Let's go back to see how this weapon came to exist. During World War I, the Germans had introduced the world to the horrors of the flamethrower with their Flammenwerfer. But those early models were crude, unreliable, and had serious limitations. The fuel burned too quickly, the range was minimal, and the whole contraption was so bulky it required two-man teams to operate. The Americans watched and learned. When World War II broke out and American forces began island hopping across the Pacific, they quickly realized they had a serious problem. The Japanese had become masters at constructing defensive positions that were virtually immune to conventional weapons. Bunkers built from coconut logs and reinforced with steel, pillboxes with 5-foot-thick concrete walls, and elaborate cave systems carved deep into volcanic rock. Artillery couldn't touch them. Mortars bounced off, and sending infantry to assault them directly resulted in devastating losses. The United States military's answer was the portable flamethrower, but the first model, the M1, was honestly a disaster. It was unreliable in the humid Pacific climate, the ignition system constantly failed, and operators sometimes had to carry cigarette lighters as backup just to get the thing to work. The effective range was only about 15 yards, meaning you had to get dangerously close to your target, and at 68 pounds when fully loaded, it was an exhausting burden to carry across rough terrain. But then came the M2-2. Introduced in the summer of 1944, the M2-2 flamethrower represented a quantum leap in incendiary weapons technology. First combat deployment was on Guam, and it immediately proved itself to be everything the M1 was not. The weapon featured a revolutionary design that would define flamethrower technology for decades to come. The M2-2 consisted of 3 cylindrical tanks welded together onto a backpack frame. 2 larger tanks held approximately 4.5 gallons of fuel, while a smaller central tank contained compressed nitrogen as the propellant. Why nitrogen? Because unlike compressed air, it was non-flammable, making the whole system marginally safer for the operator. The fuel itself was a game-changing mixture. Jellied gasoline, also known as napalm. Napalm had been developed by Harvard chemistry professor Louis Fieser on Valentine's Day, 1942. The name came from combining naphthenic and palmitic acids. This thickening agent transformed regular gasoline into a sticky gel that could travel much farther, burn much hotter, and most importantly, cling to whatever it touched. If regular gasoline was bad, napalm was an absolute nightmare. The firing mechanism was brilliantly simple yet devastatingly effective. The operator held a wand with 2 triggers. The rear trigger released the fuel from the tanks using compressed nitrogen at around 380 pounds per square inch. The front trigger activated cartridge igniters containing phosphorus matches. When both triggers were pulled, a stream of jellied fire erupted from the nozzle. The effective range was between 20 and 40 yards, depending on conditions, though maximum range could reach up to 120 feet under ideal circumstances. The M2-2 weighed about 70 pounds when fully loaded, slightly lighter than its predecessor, but still a substantial burden. But what it lacked in convenience, it more than made up for in effectiveness. The fuel consumption rate was roughly 3/4 of a gallon per second, giving operators about 7 to 10 seconds of total burn time before the tanks ran dry. Now, here's where we need to understand why this weapon was so particularly terrifying to Japanese defenders. And to do that, we need to look at Japanese defensive strategy in the later stages of the Pacific War. After suffering heavy losses in the Solomons, Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, Imperial Japanese Army strategists realized their traditional tactics weren't working. Previously, they had heavily defended landing beaches and launched large-scale banzai charges, but these attacks, while creating significant American casualties, ultimately wasted manpower and failed to stop the invasions. So, Japanese military engineers developed new tactics. They would offer only token resistance at the beaches, then withdraw into the island interior where they had prepared elaborate defensive positions. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese forces constructed interconnected networks of bunkers, pillboxes, and caves linked by tunnels that could stretch for miles underground. These weren't simple dugouts. Japanese engineers created sophisticated fortifications with multiple chambers, steel-reinforced doors, interlocking fields of fire, and ventilation systems. On Iwo Jima alone, there were 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting over 5,000 cave entrances. The volcanic rock was soft enough to tunnel through, but hard enough to withstand bombardment. Some positions had sliding armored steel doors. Artillery pieces could be wheeled out to fire, then pulled back behind impenetrable barriers. American commanders quickly discovered that conventional weapons were almost useless against these positions. Naval bombardment that lasted for days barely scratched the surface. B-29 bombing runs, while devastating to above-ground targets, couldn't reach the Japanese soldiers hiding underground. Tanks couldn't navigate the rough terrain or couldn't elevate their guns to hit cave entrances on cliff faces. And that's where the M2-2 came in. Fire could do what explosives could not. According to post-war interviews with Japanese survivors, many stated that the flamethrower was more feared than any other American weapon. And once you understand what it actually did, you can see why. The M2-2's effectiveness came from several terrifying characteristics. First, the napalm gel could splash through firing slits, bounce off walls, and flow around corners. Traditional defensive barriers that stopped bullets and shrapnel were useless against liquid fire. The stream could be directed through the narrow openings in bunkers and pillboxes, or even better, through ventilation holes that the Japanese had carved to provide air to their underground positions. Second, the napalm stuck to everything it touched and burned at incredibly high temperatures. When it hit a target, whether concrete, steel, or human flesh, it adhered like glue and continued burning. Water couldn't extinguish it. Trying to wipe it off only spread it further. The burning time could last 15 to 30 seconds or more, depending on how much fuel hit the target. Third, and perhaps most devastating, was what happened in enclosed spaces. When napalm burned inside a bunker or cave, it didn't just create heat and flame, it consumed oxygen, lots of oxygen. Japanese soldiers who weren't directly hit by the flames often perished from suffocation as the fire sucked all the breathable air from their hiding places. In deep cave systems, entire groups of defenders would be found afterward, not burned, but suffocated, having passed away from oxygen deprivation. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese defenders in fortified positions knew that if they saw an American flamethrower operator approaching, they were in serious trouble. They couldn't retreat because the tunnels often only had one exit. They couldn't surrender because the flamethrower operator couldn't see if someone was trying to give up in the smoke and chaos. And they couldn't fight back effectively because exposing themselves to return fire meant leaving the protection of their bunker. Marine Corps correspondents from Iwo Jima reported that Japanese forces concentrated all their weapons on flamethrower operators. When they spotted one approaching, they would direct mortars, machine gun fire, rifle fire, everything they had at that single target. The operators became priority targets above all others. Some Marines swore that the Japanese weren't shooting at their units, but specifically at individual flamethrower men. Operating a flamethrower was arguably one of the most dangerous jobs in the Marine Corps. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was estimated at about 4 minutes once they engaged enemy positions. Why so short? The weapon created an enormous battlefield signature. The bright orange flames were visible for hundreds of yards. The thick black smoke from burning diesel fuel in the napalm mixture created a column that pointed directly to the operator's position. And perhaps worst of all, the hiss of compressed nitrogen being released was loud and distinctive, immediately revealing the operator's exact location to enemy defenders. Then there was the fact that operators were essentially carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable material on their backs. The fuel tanks themselves were relatively bullet-resistant, made of thick metal. But the hose connecting the tanks to the wand was vulnerable. If it was struck by a bullet while pressurized and lit, well, the results were catastrophic. Other Marines often refused to share foxholes with flamethrower operators because of the explosion risk. The operators had to approach to within 20 to 25 yards of enemy positions to be effective. This meant crossing open ground, often through intense fire, weighed down by their equipment, and moving slower than regular infantry. They typically operated in teams with demolition men who carried satchel charges or pole charges, plus riflemen and bar gunners who provided covering fire. One famous flamethrower operator, Corporal Herschel "Woody" Williams, described the experience at Iwo Jima. He was a small man, just 5'6", from a farming family in West Virginia. On February 23, 1945, his unit had been stalled by a complex of pillboxes that had already caused heavy Marine casualties. Williams volunteered to take his flamethrower and deal with them. Over 4 hours, he made 5 trips back to his lines to get fresh weapons and ammunition. He crawled toward pillboxes where he could see machine gun barrels protruding from firing slits. Bullets ricocheted off his fuel tanks. He got within range and directed streams of fire at the openings. At one point, he noticed smoke coming from a ventilation pipe on top of a pillbox. He crawled up, stuck the nozzle into the pipe, and fired. Everyone inside perished. When Japanese soldiers came out of another pillbox with fixed bayonets, trying to eliminate him before he could eliminate them, he had to defend himself with the flamethrower at point-blank range. Williams received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. But he later suffered terrible nightmares about the experience, including dreams where instead of shooting fire, he was fighting to put out walls of flame. The psychological toll on flamethrower operators was severe, even for those who survived. By 1944, the Marine Corps had fully embraced the flamethrower as an essential weapon. Initially, a division might have 24 flamethrowers assigned to engineer battalions. But by the time of the F-Series division organization, each Marine division carried 243 flamethrowers into combat, distributed throughout the division structure. Each Marine regiment was assigned 81 flamethrowers. Tactical doctrine evolved rapidly through hard-won experience. Marines developed what they called corkscrew and blowtorch tactics. Assault teams would form with flamethrowers, demolition men, and automatic weapons gunners. They would approach a fortified position with the riflemen and bar men, laying down suppressing fire to keep the Japanese pinned inside their bunkers. The flamethrower operator, crouched under the weight of his weapon, would advance under this covering fire. Once in range, he would direct streams of fire through any opening he could find, firing slits, doorways, ventilation holes, anywhere the flame could penetrate. After the position was neutralized, demolition men would move in with explosive charges to collapse the structure completely, ensuring no one could reoccupy it. These tactics worked, but the casualty rate was terrible. At Iwo Jima, of the 27 Medal of Honor recipients from the battle, 12 received the award for actions involving the elimination of enemy fortified positions, usually with flamethrowers or demolitions. The vulnerability of infantry-carried flamethrowers led to an obvious solution: mount them on tanks. The concept wasn't new, but American engineers perfected it in the Pacific Theater. The M4A3 Sherman tank was modified to carry a large flamethrower in place of its hull-mounted machine gun. These modified Shermans could carry 300 gallons of napalm fuel compared to the portable flamethrowers' 4.5 gallons. The range was extended to over 100 yards, and most importantly, the crew was protected by armor. These flamethrower tanks earned nicknames like Satan and Zippo, the latter because of the cigarette lighter brand, since they were known for lighting up enemy positions. At Iwo Jima, 8 flamethrower tanks landed on the first day. Once their effectiveness became apparent, Marine infantry would actually hold their advances and wait for the Zippo tanks to be brought forward. Japanese troops did everything possible to stop these flame tanks. They launched desperate attacks with magnetic mines, satchel charges, and anything else that might disable them. But the tanks kept coming, dousing defensive positions with approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm every single day of the 36-day battle for Iwo Jima. A Marine Company commander, Captain Frank C. Caldwell, stated after the battle, "In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle." The flame tanks created such terror that a Marine Division history article noted they were the one weapon that caused the Japanese to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. A remarkable statement given the Japanese reputation for fighting to the end. The statistics from Pacific Island battles reveal just how central the flamethrower became to American tactics. On Iwo Jima, over 30% of all Japanese combat losses were directly attributed to flamethrowers, either portable or tank-mounted. That's a staggering figure when you consider all the other weapon systems employed: naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, artillery, mortars, tanks with conventional guns, and small arms. During the 36-day Iwo Jima campaign, approximately 360,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel was expended. On Okinawa, American forces used more than 200,000 gallons of napalm against defensive positions in cliffs, hills, and caves. These weren't just numbers on a logistics report. Each gallon represented streams of fire directed into Japanese defensive positions. The procurement numbers also tell a story. By 1945, Marine divisions were carrying into combat over 10 times as many flamethrowers as they had just 2 years earlier. The weapon had evolved from a specialized tool used by engineers to a standard infantry weapon distributed throughout assault units. To understand why Japanese soldiers particularly hated the M2-2, we need to consider their tactical situation. Japanese defensive doctrine in the late war period deliberately chose to fight from fortified positions because they no longer had the manpower or resources for mobile warfare. They built these elaborate tunnel and cave networks specifically to neutralize American advantages in naval gunfire, air power, and armor. For months, Japanese engineers and soldiers labored to create defenses that could withstand anything the Americans could throw at them. Concrete walls reinforced with steel, Multiple chambers with internal partitions, interconnected tunnels allowing movement between positions, camouflaged entrances, steel doors. Everything was designed to create positions that could survive bombardment and require Americans to dig them out one by one at enormous cost. And then the M2-2 made most of those preparations nearly worthless. The thick concrete walls that stopped artillery shells? Fire could flow through the firing slits. The steel-reinforced doors? They had to have ventilation holes, and fire could reach through those. The elaborate tunnel networks? They became death traps when fire consumed the oxygen. The camouflaged entrances? Flamethrower teams would systematically work through an area, directing fire into every cave opening they found. Japanese survivors interviewed after the war stated that being in a fortified position under flamethrower attack was psychologically devastating. You couldn't see what was coming. You could hear the hiss of compressed nitrogen, then smell the burning fuel. Then suddenly your position would be filled with fire and smoke and heat, and the oxygen would vanish. Some chose to rush out and face bullets rather than burn or suffocate in their bunkers. The flamethrower became one of the most controversial weapons of World War II. Even during the war, a myth circulated among American troops that using flamethrowers against enemy personnel had been banned by the Geneva Conventions because of the weapon's effects. This wasn't true. The Geneva Conventions had no such prohibition. But the fact that the myth existed reveals something about how even the users of the weapon viewed it. The effects of the M2-2 on human targets were, to put it mildly, severe. Direct hits resulted in burns that were almost always fatal. The high temperature of burning napalm caused damage that was difficult to even describe within the bounds of what we can discuss here. Even veterans who used the weapon, like Woody Williams, later expressed profound psychological trauma from what they had witnessed and done. One Marine who trained with the M2-2 described his first practice session firing it at a tree stump. He watched the napalm hit with a loud spattering noise, felt the heat on his face, and saw the cloud of black smoke rush upward. He wrote later, "The thought of turning loose hellfire from a hose nozzle as easily as I'd water a lawn back home sobered me. To engage the enemy with bullets or eliminate them with shrapnel was one of the grim necessities of war, but to do so with fire was too gruesome to contemplate. I was to learn soon, however, that the Japanese couldn't be routed from their island defenses without it." That last sentence captures the moral complexity of the weapon. It was horrific. It caused tremendous suffering. But given Japanese defensive tactics and the brutal calculus of the Pacific War, American commanders concluded it was necessary. The alternative was sending more infantry into direct assaults on fortified positions, which would have resulted in even higher American casualties. The M2-2 remained in service far beyond World War II. Variants saw combat in Korea and Vietnam. The basic design proved so effective that it remained relatively unchanged for decades. The M2A12 was used in Korea. The M2A17 and M9A17 were deployed in Vietnam. The core concept, backpack-mounted tanks, compressed gas propellant, igniter system, and wand-style projector, stayed essentially the same. The United States military finally retired flamethrowers from service in 1978, not because they had become ineffective, but because they had become politically and morally untenable. International opinion had turned decisively against incendiary weapons. While no treaty explicitly banned flamethrowers, the direction of international law was clear, and the Pentagon chose to phase them out. But the M2-2's impact on military history extends far beyond its years of service. It fundamentally changed how military forces approached fortified positions. It demonstrated that psychological weapons could be as important as weapons that simply created casualties. And it showed that sometimes the most effective military tool is also the most morally troubling. Interestingly, flamethrowers have seen a resurgence in recent conflicts. In the war in Ukraine, both sides have deployed portable flamethrowers in urban and trench combat situations. The tactical problems that the M2-2 was designed to solve, enemies in fortified positions that are difficult to reach with conventional weapons, haven't gone away. Warfare continues to evolve, but some challenges remain constant. China currently issues the Type 74 flamethrower to its soldiers. Other nations maintain similar weapons in their arsenals. The basic concept that made the M2-2 effective in 1944 remains valid today. When you need to clear a heavily defended position that conventional weapons can't reach, fire is still one of the most effective tools. The M2-2 flamethrower stands as one of World War II's most effective yet most controversial weapons. Its technical innovations, reliable ignition, napalm fuel, portable design, made it a practical battlefield tool. Its tactical application turned Japanese defensive strongpoints from impregnable fortresses into death traps, and its psychological impact made it the most feared weapon in the Pacific theater. For Japanese soldiers defending islands in the Pacific, the M2-2 represented a fundamental negation of their defensive strategy. Months of labor creating elaborate fortifications could be undone in seconds by a Marine with a flamethrower. The weapon that their commanders had hoped would protect them became instead a guarantee of a horrific fate. The M2-2's story reveals uncomfortable truths about warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapons are also the most terrible. Sometimes tactical necessity conflicts with moral concerns, and sometimes, in the brutal calculus of war, commanders choose weapons not despite their horrifying effects, but because of them. From a weapon that didn't look promising at first, the M2-2 became legendary. It earned its place in history not just through technical innovation, but through psychological impact, and for the Japanese soldiers who faced it from within their fortified positions, it became the embodiment of why, despite all their preparations and all their determination, the island defenses could not hold. The dark reason Japanese soldiers hated the M2-2 wasn't just because it was effective at causing casualties, it was because it turned their greatest strength, their fortified positions, into their greatest weakness. It was because it offered no defense and no escape. And it was because it represented a form of warfare that, even in the brutal context of World War II, stood out as particularly terrible. That legacy remains with us today, a reminder that in warfare, the most effective weapons are often those we most wish had never been invented. If you stuck around till the end, I appreciate it, my friend. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hang around. There's plenty more history worth digging into together.